just in case. I gave you a wheel down there, just in case. Yes. We good, Angelica? All right. Hello, everyone. It's so great to have all of you here tonight. My name is Mitch Boersma. I'm the Director of Operations here at the CIC. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you here in person and joining on the live stream for this wonderful occasion to launch Dean Abela's new book, Superhabits, The Universal System for a Successful Life. I'm particularly excited about this event tonight with a unique appreciation for the years of thought, organizing, reorganizing, and writing that Dean Abela has put into this project. And I fell in love with it several years ago when he was test driving an early version of it for the Leonine Fellows here in this room, when he was starting to map out the tree of virtue originally as a series of cascading branches. And then he hit on this brilliant cohesion of mapping it not just as branches of a tree, but rather the trunk of the tree with concentric circles. He might get into that, he might not. It's so cool. When he hit on that, we decided to make it the Rosetta Stone of the entirety of our first Leonine Forum National Conference here back in 2023. Since then, I've seen him present on it in California at the Napa Institute Summer Conference. Again, last week as the guiding force behind the Napa Faith and Business Conference in New York City. Now here again tonight. I'm like a Swiftie when it comes to Andrew Abela. Like traveling around the country, seeing him at all of his stuff, but I just can't get enough of it. I mean, to my mind, there is nothing more on brand for the CIC than this idea of smuggling the entire Thomistic treatise on virtue into the mainstream of self-help movement sweeping the country right now. So I'm really excited about tonight. I'm going to hand it over here to Dean Abela, first with a formal introduction. Andrew Abela is the founding dean of the Bush School of Business and a professor of marketing at the Catholic University of America. He is a faculty affiliate at the Harvard University Human Flourishing Program and a contributor at Force.com. His research on the integrity of the marketing process, including marketing ethics, Catholic social doctrine, and internal communication, has been published in several academic journals. Dr. Abela also provides consulting and training to internal communications to Fortune 100 corporations. He's the winner of the 2009 Novak Award, a $10,000 prize given by the Acton Institute for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. That's where I first encountered Dr. Abela when I was working as a research assistant for Michael Novak. It was the beginning of my life as an Abela groupie, I suppose. Prior to his academic career, he spent several years in industry as a brand manager at Procter & Gamble, management consultant with McKinsey & Company, and a managing director of the Marketing Leadership Council of the Corporate Executive Board. He and his wife, Kathleen, who's here with us tonight, have 6 children, 3 of whom so far have graduated from Catholic U. We're so excited to have him here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abela.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially because this is before your time, Mitch, but the very first time I spoke at the CIC was, I think, about 16, 17 years ago, and 3 people showed up. One of them is back here tonight, so that's Mark, wherever you are. Thank you, buddy, for your belief. That's right. Thank you for believing in me.
And your wife, the other?
No, she didn't come. No, the other was a friend and his son. So they actually moved us to the boardroom because it felt a little embarrassing in here, you know. So anyway.
He's from Malta.
Mark is, that's right, exactly, yes. Fellowship. So I want to say a little bit first why I wrote the book and tell you a little bit about it. Sophia Press is wonderful about getting me on TV and radio. I was on EWTN News Nightly yesterday. Those of you who saw it, very nice. It's fun. So you get on a lot of radio shows, and they always ask you, why did you write the book? And I'm almost tempted to say, so I'll just say it here for fun, for the money, you know. See, there must be some authors in the room because you know just how funny that is. You know, on a per hour basis, you make more money working at McDonald's, you know, writing books, seriously, for a book of this kind. But writing a book is way more fun than working at McDonald's. So it wins out in that way. But the main reason I did it is, so as you know, Mitch mentioned, I run the Bush School of Business. I was the founding dean 12 years ago. And the goal was to found a business school that was committed to forming faithful Catholics in business. So we research, we write about, we teach how to be a faithful Catholic in business. And so we embedded the Catholic social teaching into everything we did. But it became evident to me after a few years that that's just not enough. It's not enough to give the students principles or values, as people say. because it's too easy to stray from your values. People do it all the time. You have to somehow take those values and turn them into habits, into virtues, because it's much harder to stray. While people will act against their values frequently, they very rarely act against their habits. So we started to think about how do we incorporate virtue more into the program. And so I started to do research, think about it, do a lot of reading. And then I started to notice something happening in the wider world. I first saw this in an article from Deloitte, written by some consultants, including an old friend of mine from years back. And this Deloitte article was making the case that it's not enough for your employees to have the proper skills, but they also have to have these underlying essential capabilities, they call them. But what are these capabilities? Things like courage and self-discipline and generosity and honesty and humility. And I thought, gee, those look familiar, you know. About a year later, McKinsey and Company, the McKinsey Quarterly, published a white paper. In this case, they made a similar argument and said not enough to have skilled employees. The employees also have to have, and they call them distinct elements of talent. Well, what are distinct elements of talent? Courage and self-discipline and honesty and humility. And it's like, okay, starting to recognize a pattern here, you know. So this is happening. Then in the same time, earlier, is the whole positive psychology movement, where they are studying individual virtues empirically and finding out, what do you know, the ancients were right. As you grow in virtue, you get happier, and all kinds of other good things happen as well. So lots and lots of studies. So I was reading many of those studies, and it's like the same story again and again and again, where it doesn't matter whether they're studying generosity or gratitude or humility, whatever they're studying, the more somebody grows in that, the happier they get. They usually get physically healthier as well, which is really, one of my favorite studies was on gratitude. There was a double-blind, a test where you have the control and test group. And the test group, the only thing they did different from the control group is they kept a daily gratitude diary, which is a good way of helping somebody grow in gratitude. And at the end of a short period of time, maybe 2 months of keeping this gratitude diary, this test group were not only happier than the control group, they were physically and mentally healthier. They had a reduction in depression, reduction in anxiety, reduction in chronic pain, you know, so, which is amazing, you know. But the same story, happier, healthier, more effective, life gets easier across all of these. So you've got the management consultant literature, you've got the positive psychology, and then you've got these books about habits selling millions of copies. People say, why did you put habit in the well, I was hoping to sell millions of copies. You know? Then it really would be for the money, you know. So, so there's this sort of obsession, fascination with habits as a way to improve your life. The books are all about how to grow, how to develop habits, but they say nothing about which habits. So anything, any habit will do, you know. And so I'm looking at all these and saying, this is what is happening here is a rediscovery of virtue. Well, why did we lose it in the first place? If you want to go read Alistair MacIntyre in After Virtue, he kind of talks all about that, how through the Reformation and so on, as people started to blame religion for everything bad in the world, they started to abandon anything that had any kind of religious overtones. And virtue went out the window with that. And it got replaced by modern ethics, which is almost useless. I can say that because my PhD is in business ethics, so I have studied this stuff. And the problem with modern ethics is it can't tell you what's right and what's wrong or how to behave. So it's like, well, what good are you? You know, it's like, so if you look around and you see so many of the problems in our society, the kind of division, massive division in this country, problems with productivity, problems with anxiety, depression, etc., you can attribute much or almost all of these to a lack of virtue. That if we could somehow have a kind of a return to virtue in our country, so many of the problems would go away. I'm not saying we'd have heaven on earth, but things would be a heck of a lot better if we could do this. And so I'm seeing these different groups groping towards this, finding success each in their own niche, but apparently oblivious of each other. So I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea just to sort of bring it all together? You know, just say, look, everybody, what you're actually looking for is called virtue, and it incorporates the best of everything that you've written about, the best about habits, because virtues are habits, the best about the positive psychology, about the health and happiness benefits, and the best of what the management consultants were writing about. So that's what I attempted to do in the book. But I realized, I'm going to have to write something true, not just an amalgamation of what's out there. So I needed a firm foundation to ground everything, and I found that in St. Thomas Aquinas. It was actually during COVID that I decided to do what any good Catholic business dean would do, and with the 3 hours I gained from not having to commute in and out to Catholic U every day, I spent my time reading the Summa Theologica. Anyway, it was very heavily repaid, positively repaid. Actually, not the whole thing, but the treatise on the virtues, which is the entire middle section. And I had this sort of aha moment when I realized that what St. Thomas was doing is not just making a list of virtues, which is what everybody else seems to do. Good, faithful Catholics who write books about virtues tell you how wonderful the virtues are and tell you how to grow in them, and you never find a decent overlap in the list of virtues. So every book has a different list of virtues. They tend to overlap on the cardinal virtues. Thank God, there's something common, but then they go off in every direction, and you sit there and you're wondering, okay, so where does it end? How many virtues are there, And is every positive abstract noun a virtue? It's like tolerance, integrity. Like, people throw around these words, and they're just certainly not in a classical sense are they virtues. But how are you ever going to get a sense of how are you ever going to put your arms around the life of virtue if you don't know how many virtues there are? And if even people who agree on everything, that they kind of all faithful Catholics can't seem to agree on what are the virtues, So, well, what are we going to do with this? So that was a struggle, and I found the answer in St. Thomas Aquinas, because what he does is he creates an integrated framework. He's not just listing the virtues, but he actually starts out from the whole of a human life and draws distinctions repeatedly. So he starts out by distinguishing between our supernatural and natural lives, and he shows how there are the three theological virtues for the supernatural life: faith, hope, and charity. And then in our natural lives, he draws a distinction between intellectual and practical, what we usually call the moral virtues. I prefer talking about practical because of a simple experiment we did. We took this framework of virtues of St. Thomas Aquinas, and we created a sort of interactive diagnostic for our students. It's still available on the web. And we would say, okay, go choose, and then you ask a series of questions following St. Thomas's taxonomy, and it tells you, okay, you should probably be working on this virtue. And so we had them go through, started out with intellectual, spiritual, and moral, and they would click. And guess what? None of the students clicked on, because the question would be, where do you want to improve your life? Nobody clicks on moral. Because everyone said, well, I'm a moral person. I don't need to improve in that area. Change the word moral to practical, boom, everyone goes there, But it's the same thing in a way. So from the natural law perspective, right, it's the same thing. If you want to live an orderly, effective, practical life, you live the moral life, right? Because it's basically living in accord with the natural law. So seeing that, discovering that was very exciting. And so I thought, okay, I want to give this to the world, because there are people who know this, and they hide it carefully, unintentionally, behind a complex Thomistic language. Makes it inaccessible to everybody else, And to say that the only way you can learn what Thomas is teaching about virtue is to get at least 2 years of undergraduate philosophy is to say that we're kind of hiding this from people. We need to find a way to just break it wide open. So that's what I wanted to do. So my first idea was a book that I was going to call Virtue and Owner's Guide. And there was going to be a chapter or two explaining all of this structure of St. Thomas, and then there was going to be an appendix of 50, kind of 2 or 3 pages each, and each of those sections, if you will, on each of the virtues. And it would have a summary and kind of a definition of the virtue, a summary of all the scientific research on it, what all the studies say about it. Then there was actually scriptural resources as well. What does the Bible say? I even got ecumenical and drew some quotes from some other religions and so on about these virtues, because you'll find the same virtues or similar in Islam, as well as Judaism, as well as Christianity, as well as Confucianism, and so on, because it's human nature, right? So you find it everywhere. So I had that, and then I had a bunch of little stories, anecdotes that we pulled. I worked with a number of graduate students on this, pulled from a number of autobiographies of successful business people to show kind of what each of these virtues looks like in the wild, as it were. And so it was pretty much done. I had the introductory chapters. I had these appendix items, for each of the 50 virtues. So a lot of work, but 3 years went into that. Like, okay, it's good. Now I just have to find a publisher. And so I had a little trouble doing that. And then I showed it to my wife, and she looks at it and she goes, I credit Kathleen and my wife for her fearless criticism, is what I call it. So she read a couple of these and she said, you know what? This is really boring. It's like, oh, crap. Okay. So, well, what's the point of doing the work if no one's going to read it, right? If it's boring, no one's going to read it. I can't make people want virtue, A joke we have in my household is I'm not a professor of philosophy. I'm a professor of marketing. So I'm not doing philosophy. I'm trying to sell virtue. I'm trying to share the excitement, the love I have for virtue to people who don't know it, and just get them to fall in love with virtue as well. So I thought, all right, back to the drawing board. We have the content, but how are we going to present it? And so the idea of writing something that looked and smelled and sounded like a self-help book came, and I thought, well, let me just try that. And so I've always been a fan of the work of Malcolm Gladwell. Some of you would know him. He's just so enticing by the stories that he tells. So you learn things from reading his stories. Turns out that several of his books have some really glaring errors in them, so they're fundamentally wrong on some important points, but the stories are so convincing no one cares, or no one notices. I had the benefit of being grounded in St. Thomas Aquinas, right, who is rock solid, and then all of this contemporary science, which is validating what Aquinas said, so like there isn't stronger ground than I can think of, you've got centuries and Aquinas himself, as you know, was working off Aristotle. So I've got centuries of philosophy, one of the greatest saints, so in the intellectual terms the church has, and then all this modern science, and it's all agreeing, all saying the same thing. So I thought, okay, if I could write stories about this, then that would be really powerful, So I tried to do that and started and found and just kept finding more and more really interesting stories. Interesting and moving stories. I've had some people say to me that they cried reading some of the stories in the book, which I don't think was over my grammar, So I was glad. I think it's because the stories, but I was glad to hear that because I cried when I was writing them. I mean, when you start looking for virtue in action, you find the best in human existence. It's truly, the virtues are habits of excellence, right? And so when you look for virtues, or you look for people growing in virtues, you find this kind of most excellent examples of humanity. I was on a podcast yesterday with a woman who kind of zeroed right into this. Her name is Valentina Imhoff. She's a coach, executive coach, and she zeroed it right in. I have chapters on the virtue of prudence or practical wisdom. And according to Aquinas, the virtue of practical wisdom has 8 kind of sub-virtues or partial virtues associated with it that take you through from kind of gathering the information you need, processing the information, and then taking action. Because Aquinas, very wise, he says a decision isn't complete until it's actually enacted, until you act on it. And so I use this with our students a lot, because you take any decision-making framework that you try to teach in a business school, and you can map it to the virtue of prudence, the virtue of practical wisdom. And it's so much more effective if instead of teaching students a decision-making framework, you give them the habit, right? You get them to practice the habit of practical wisdom. So we would do this. So I wanted to explain this. And so I found the story of Captain Sullenberger. Many of you will remember 2009, at Flight 1549, crash landed on the Hudson River. And so what I was able to do, so I read his autobiography, various stories from the time, and then I actually went and read the accident report, huge thing from the National Transportation Safety Board, and they give you second by second what happened. And the reason it's such a great story and such a great fit is so the plane, if you remember, had barely taken off, so it was not very high above Manhattan. It hit a large flock of rather large birds and blew out both engines at the same time. So this plane is without power just above Manhattan, and he had literally at most 3.5 minutes to do something with this plane, else it would crash, kill everybody on the plane, and who knows how many thousands below, because you're over Manhattan, right? A highly densely populated place. So I go through kind of minute by minute, second by second, of all the decisions that he's going through in his mind, and how each of those 8 partial virtues kind of comes to life. And then I keep sort of freeze framing the plane in the air and go and do a flashback to earlier in his life about how he grew. And the various sub-virtues include things like judgment, which is having the ability, or the habit of choosing the right principle to make a particular decision, or creativity, which is kind of generating options, or teachability, sometimes called docility, which is to have the ability to learn well, and so on. And just showing how through his life, he was always growing in each of these 8. So when the moment came with this life or death situation, he was able to very quickly make a bunch of really inspired decisions. And then, because it was, okay, we have to land the plane quickly. Can we reach any of the many runways? There's LaGuardia, there's JFK, there's Teterboro, which is a private, no, you can quickly rule out all of those. I couldn't reach that, we would crash. Could you land on a highway? Around Manhattan, those of you who've been there, you know there are no highways without bridges. So there's no landing on a highway. Any open spaces? It's Manhattan, no. Maybe Central Park, but there's too many hills and there's no flat space where you could land a jet. How about the water? Well, there's 2 choices. There's around LaGuardia, there's some open water over there, and then there's the Hudson. Again, he's doing this computation and realizes that if I land on the Hudson, there's far more rescue resources. This is January, right? So this is freezing water, life expectancy about 20 minutes. If a passenger were to fall in the water, they would freeze to death. Or hypothermia would kill them, you know? So he's going through all of this. Remember, 3.5 minutes, right? And terrifying circumstance. Anyway, so he does this successfully, as you know, lands the plane on the water. Everybody's rescued, not a single life lost. Incidentally, I was talking to somebody about LinkedIn. We were talking about before. I've been posting a lot about these super habits on LinkedIn. And I actually completely randomly came across one of the passengers from flight 1549. And so I introduced myself. I sent him the chapter, asked him if he could read it, tell me, was I on? And he said, yep, exactly right. So I was relieved to hear that. And then I actually interviewed him over Zoom. So for about 10 minutes, had him tell the story. Man, very, very, very powerful. Even now, 16 years later, you could tell he still has difficulty kind of reliving that. So that was beautiful. But so he lands this successfully. But then the part of the story that Valentina pulled out was Sullenberger mentions that for years after this happens, he would be walking around somewhere randomly, and some stranger would recognize him and say, "Oh, you're Sully." And he said, and they would start crying. That was the often reaction. They would cry. Now, why would people cry? He didn't know why, and he couldn't say in his autobiography. My suggestion is this, is that what he was demonstrating was pure virtue, and understood as sheer kind of top-notch competence ordered to the good, right? So doing something with real excellence for a really good reason, you know? And we just don't see that very much in our society. So when they see that there in the flesh, you just cry because you're just so happy and so moved, you know? And so what I try to do with these stories is just give people a feeling for what this is like, and then give them practical advice on how do you begin. Because oftentimes the danger of telling stories about really amazing people is you figure, well, that's nice for them. That could never be me, you know. And that I see that with our students, you know. So I start the book out with a story of somebody who's very heroic. I have a chapter on the virtue of resilience, a tragedy, but I won't go into that one. But then I raised the question, okay, so maybe she was just the virtue of restraint. Maybe she was very restrained and that worked for her. But what about those of us who maybe feel like don't have the habit of restraint, the virtue of restraint? And so I tell the story of a young teenager. Dewey was his nickname. And Dewey was a very large kid who came from a troubled family, poor family. And he was always getting into mischief because he was very unrestrained. If he wanted something from a store, they had no money, so he would steal it. If somebody annoyed him, he would beat him up because he was such a big guy. Until one day, his mom, his father had been cheating on his mother and so on, it was all horrible. One day his mom had to come and spring him from the police station from his latest transgression, and she just breaks down and she's crying. It's like, why are you so bad, and so on. And so he tells, I relate from his account of that night lying in bed saying, why am I such a jerk? My mom suffers so much, I'm just making it worse. And so he tries to make an effort to grow in the virtue of restraint and to restrain these unruly passions that he had. And he does it by, and it's a beautiful story because it matches exactly what Aquinas says, is you don't take those passions and try to stifle them, you redirect them. You redirect them to something more productive. And Dewey did that. He started to play football. So when he had anger and frustration, wanted to pound someone, he would just do it on the football field where he would get rewarded for it, you know. Likewise, then he got into wrestling, and same thing, was a very successful wrestler. So successful in both that he spent a year in the NFL. That's as far as he got, but then he had a pro wrestling career, very successful, went on into Hollywood and was fabulously successful, and you know him as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, right? So just this terrific story of somebody who didn't have the virtue, but then developed this particular virtue, and his whole life changed because of it, you know? So try to be encouraging to people and say, you can do this. And so at the end of every chapter, I draw from the research to suggest particular, call them hacks, if you will, little practices that one can start with. And I use the phrase, beginning is winning. That all you need to do is take the little first step. And the little first step gets you going. It becomes a habit, and then you can layer on another and another, and you're growing in virtue from the get-go. I just think it's hugely powerful. Because Mitch put it here, I want to show you the picture. So this comes with every book. You get your own suitable for framing poster size. This is the Aquinas layout of all the virtues. I won't take you through the detail of it, but the book lays out how it all works. But then the other thing we added is just before the book went to press, I met with a venture capitalist, and we were talking about this, and he asked me to send him the manuscript, so I sent it to him. And this guy's a real dynamo. And he wrote back to me and he said, I read it 3 times. This is a guy also who doesn't lie. So I believe him. He read it 3 times. He says, I love it. He says, you should make an app out of this to help people. And I thought, well, I would do that, but I have no idea how to make apps. I mean, I use them. I don't know how to make an app. So he said, very easy. He said, I've funded many apps. All you need is a coder, i.e. somebody who writes programming. You know, so it's like, okay, I'll see if I can find a coder. My son is a serial entrepreneur and a coder, and he had just finished his second big endeavor. Finished being a nice way of saying it didn't go anywhere, so he was now looking. It's good. I mean, that's how entrepreneurship works. You try, and sometimes it works. Anyway, so he was looking for a job, and I said, hey, Dominic, how about this, you know? He's like, oh, that sounds interesting. Do we have any funding? No. So then I went back to the venture capitalist. I said, all right, I have a coder. What now? He goes, now you need funding. So how do I do that? He said, well, I'll give you the money. I'll buy you 5% of the company, whatever. So, okay, so I go home to Dominic, and I said, no, now we need to open up a company so this guy can send us a check. So tomorrow morning, I'll take you to the bank manager. I know him. He's been in my town for many years, you know, and we'll open an account. And my son looked at me as if I had horns. And he sat down, opened up his laptop, and in 15 minutes, he had an account open, and everything set up. It's like, okay, good, I picked the right guy. You know? So he's the CEO. I work for him. Yeah. So there's a QR code in the book that leads you to this app. The app, or you find it on the web, superhabits.app, easy to remember. And what it does is it's a survey, and you go through the survey, about 15 minutes, and then it tells you, kind of gives you all of your virtues on a scale of 1 to 7. So it tells you where you're virtuous and where not so much. And then the way forward is to pick one of the not so much and decide that you're going to work on it, and you're going to practice something little every day. But we also built in this AI coach. So you tell it what virtue you want to grow in, and it will suggest a little practice to do every day, and then it will keep bugging you every day to make sure that you do it. It will text you and say, so did you do it today? And if you didn't, it will suggest maybe something easier, something different, and kind of just back and forth. And it really seems to work. I had this very sweet piece of feedback from a senior executive, former Microsoft executive, who said he was using the app, and he was trying to grow in the virtue of teachability, sometimes called docility, and particularly the ability to listen. Because he thought he'd been married for 30 years, and the feedback he often got from his wife is, you never listen. You know, so it's a very unusual marriage. That never happens. So anyway, so he's telling this story, and he said, the practice was listen for 5 minutes without speaking, once a day. That's what the AI thing tasked him to do. So he's sitting there listening to his wife, surreptitiously looking at his watch to make sure he gets his 5 minutes. And around 2 minutes, she stopped talking. And so he said to her, do you have anything else to say? And she paused. She goes, yes, I do. And she carried on. And then she stopped. She goes, is something wrong with you? So she was surprised, but happy, very happy. So I met her later, and she thanked me for the app. So I mean, we're seeing this. It does actually work. Because somebody once challenged, like, can an app help you grow in virtue? Absolutely, absolutely. Because the key thing is to get the practice, you know. And so that's what we try to do with the young people, is get them practicing. And once you have the experience of what it's like to grow in virtue, you just want more. And that's what I need to think. We need to explain to them what is virtue, why it makes your life so much easier, happier, healthier, more effective. And then all it takes is just take a little step and off you go. You know, so I think it's hugely powerful. I promised not to go on forever because I really could. I mean, my wife's here, she could affirm that. So maybe I pause now in case there are any questions or comments. Anybody would like to share how your marriage got better with the app? Yes, sir.
Is it Android or Apple or both?
It's neutral because it's straight from the internet. So you can do it on a PC or your phone, but just go to whatever app you use to get to Chrome or Safari or whatever, and just type in so just go on the web, type in superhabits.app, and it acts like an app, but you don't have to download anything. It works really well. Apparently, that's the way the new apps are developed, I'm told. What would I know? So yeah, so it's easy to do. Yes.
Yeah, as I told you, I have your book at home. I haven't read it yet because it just came. So it may be in here, this answer, but my question is, what do you do with, how did you treat virtues like trust and forgiveness, which are huge, but St. Thomas doesn't exactly name them as such?
So, trust, I think, is an outcome, not a virtue. So honesty is the virtue. I think when you live honesty, you get trust, is how I interpret it. Forgiveness, so I had a lot of fun, we were talking about this before, with the translations. Because there's a lot of word. Part of the problem with virtue is a lot of the words related to virtue have lost their meaning, including the word virtue itself for most people. They think it either just means values, or it just means generically kind of goodness, or it means being, you know, virtue signaling, which is horrible, you know. So that's why I came up with the term superhabits. It's another word for virtue, because virtues are habits, but they're a very special kind of sort of superpower habit because of what they allow you to do. So that's my name for virtue. But likewise, so for forgiveness, I thought to myself, it cannot be. So I'm what one of my old professors used to call a Thomist of the strict observance, or TOSO. I think St. Thomas is like awesome. And so if he didn't think it was a virtue, I don't think it was a virtue. And it's not just because I'm a Thomist of the strict observance. It's because when he makes those distinctions I was talking about and that I draw out in the wheel, he leaves no gaps. So if he didn't cover it, it's not there, because there are no gaps in his framework. So the answer you'll have to say, well, where would you put it? There's no room, you know. So, but forgiveness, I think, is what he called clemency. He has a virtue that he calls clemency. For us, clemency means a governor pardons somebody and before they get to the electric chair. It has that very narrow meaning. But I think what he was talking about was just forgiveness in general. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so what I tried to do is I took all of the positive psychology virtues and I tried to make sure that they matched to what Aquinas was doing, because I think he's got the right idea. And so forgiveness was one of them. And there's a lot of research around forgiveness, and it's clearly a virtue. And so I think that's where it fits in. But that would be, it's very interesting. It's one of the virtues that comes under self-discipline. You wouldn't think of forgiveness as a matter of self-discipline, but for Aquinas, self-discipline or temperance is the cardinal virtue of only following your feelings, your desires, when it makes sense to do so. And what forgiveness, along with meekness, which we can talk about in a moment if you like, do is they are for moderating our desire for having things go the way we want them to go. Like we all are willful, we want things to be the way they are. When somebody does something that you didn't want to happen and really annoys you or offends you or hurts you, then the proper response after the fact is forgiveness. Because if you don't exercise forgiveness, you just carry that weight with you forever. And you just suffer unnecessarily. So forgiveness is I just want to mention, because I love this other one, so the way I see them in Aquinas is you have forgiveness for when things haven't gone the way you want them to go in the past, and so now the proper response is forgiveness. Meekness is the virtue for when things aren't going the way you want them to go in the moment, and you get angry. Anger arises when things aren't going the way you want them to go. But the problem with the word meekness, again, added to the list of words that have lost their meaning, is it sounds like weakness, and for most people it means the same thing. But it doesn't. What meekness truly means, the Latin word mansuetudo, means strength and gentleness at the same time, firmness and gentleness at the same time. So instead of using the word meekness, I invented a word, and I call it gentle firmness. Not very creative, but very clear. Right? Gentle firmness is the habit of taking your anger and using it productively. So the two opposing vices would be, one, you blow up every time you get angry, not very helpful. The other is you stifle that anger until it kills you inside, you know. Neither of those very healthy. The healthy thing to do is anger is a signal that things aren't going the way you want them to do. So the very first step is it the things that are the problem or the way I want them that's the problem? Because it could be either, you know. And so once you decide that, then you use the energy from the anger to try to make it right, either to change your own view or to change the world to make it right. So, yes, Steve.
Dean Abela, you talked very well about how you start your students and how they do the inventory. And is there some way that you then follow up to measure what progress they've made and help them see the progress and that sort of thing?
So we, a couple of years ago, we did a survey of our graduates. Now, we've been thinking about and kind of mentoring on virtues since the beginning, but tried to formalize it more recently. So I don't know how much of this can be directly attributed to the virtue work, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with it. So we surveyed our alumni. We had Gallup do the survey because they have a benchmark of all graduates from undergraduate business programs, which would be ours, and compare how they're doing. And they had measures of the kind of financial well-being, personal well-being, social well-being, but also we were able to use measures of a couple of virtues, one on hope, one on charity, I think, and then compare how they were doing. And it's risky. You pay a lot of money, do the research, and you hope. And the results were fabulous. That our students, on every single measure, students were outperforming their peers, which says that I think there's something to this. One of the terms I use when I talk about this collection of virtues is I refer to it as the human operating system, which some people find a little mechanistic, but I just think it's a useful analogy in this sense. If you think about your phone or your laptop, when you don't update the operating system, what happens? Right? The apps start to slow down. I think the analogy is very apt because in our society, we have not been updating the virtues, not been keeping people virtuous. As a result, everything is slowing down or getting worse, And so when we allow our students to upgrade their operating system, everything else seems to go well. So that's the best measure I have. Everything else would be anecdotal, so. Yes.
First of all, I want to say it's nice to see you again. I actually heard your talk at Texas A&M a couple years back, so it's really nice to be here. My question was, how do you consolidate kind of the idea of, as you said, like competence as being like excellence and virtue, along with kind of St. Paul's idea of not being ambitious?
What specifically are you referring to about not being ambitious?
I think there's like a line in scripture where St. Paul says like, don't be ambitious in the world. Like don't, I guess in that sense, he's saying like, don't step over people. But many people I've met actually kind of have this notion of not excelling or like not being very successful in order to like be more Christian, which I don't think is correct. Like, I think your point of view is correct, but how would you consolidate that?
Sure. I think, the two mistakes that particularly young people could make now is one is convince yourself that the only way to succeed is to kind of heck with everybody else, climb over people's backs to get what you want. That fails in the long term for most people. Certainly fails in the very long term after you die. but the other extreme is to sort of wimp out, and just like, well, I'm afraid of being caught up in a sinful structure, so I'm just going to hide, I'm just going to do something less than I could otherwise do. And I think the way to, as you say, consolidate is literally to live the life of virtue. Because if you do everything we're talking about here, so be courageous, be self-disciplined, be just, live each of these virtues, then whatever circumstance you're in, that's always going to be the right call. The success may or may not come. Odds are most of the time it will come, particularly because the competition is so poor. There aren't that many virtuous people out there. So when somebody shows up who's virtuous, it's like, goodness, where did you come from? And how do I get more of you? That's actually the reaction we get for a lot of the companies who hire our students. They come back, can we have 10 more? It's like, yeah, I'd love to, So I think it's always the right thing, no matter your personal circumstances. Are you sick? Are you working in a big company? Are you in prison? Are you in a war zone? Living the virtues is always the right answer, will always get you the best outcome in the broader sense of the term. Good. I think we're good.
One more.
All right, take one more. Yes.
Oh, here, one more.
Thank you, Dr. Abela. It's good to see you again. Did any groups or organizations like Exodus 90, for example, influence which virtues you picked for the book?
No, I mentioned before that my guide was St. Thomas directly. But if there was influence, it was with the positive psychology research. I wanted, as much as possible, to have virtues that were in St. Thomas and grounded in empirical research. And by and large, I think I was able to get most of those. There's so many other groups that have different virtues. I said they're somewhat overlapping, not entirely overlapping. That's great. Anybody who's doing work on virtues is great. But I think if we could all anchor on St. Thomas, it would make things easier and safer. Because otherwise, you can, I love the schools that do character education where they try to get kids growing in virtue. But one of the things some schools will do is the virtue of the week. That, I'm just not sure that's a good idea. First of all, a week is a very short time in which to learn about a virtue, let alone to grow in that virtue. But secondly, I worry that it gives the kids a sense that there's just this never-ending list. Okay, for the next 4 years, every week there's going to be another virtue. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'd rather you just pick one or two. With our students, so I have them for 4 years in the Bush School, all I want is for each one of them to grow in one virtue. More if possible, but one is enough, because I want them to see that something I didn't think I could be, I now am. I thought I was a disorganized person. I thought I was not a very creative person. I thought I was a fearful person, and that's no longer true because I made the effort and I grew in that virtue. Once that happens then you realize it can happen across the other 49, So that's I think the way to do it.
Please join me in thanking Dean Abela.
Thank you.
The book, Superhabits, it's available for sale in fine bookstores all around you. Dean Abela will be, especially here, Dean Abela will be out there ready to sign books. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you.